I'm just trying to make it all make sense.
The
More
You
No
Podcast.
Today I want to discuss Judith Orloff's guide to surviving emotional vampires shared in her book Emotional Freedom. Emotional vampires are people in your life who drain your emotional energy. They literally suck the positive emotions out of you. And because of this, it's important to understand how to recognize and handle emotional vampires. So I now want to go through Judith's guide, which has 4 different sections. It's going to help you recognize emotional vampires, as well as to deploy techniques to deflect negativity. Ultimately, the guide will enable you to stay centered in difficult relationships. So the first part of the guide is to determine if you're being sapped by an emotional vampire. There's a few indicators for if your positive energy is being taken away from you by emotional vampires. The first is if you feel put down or like the rug was pulled out from under you. The second is if your mood takes a nosedive when you're around the person. And the third is you feel sniped at, slimed, or agitated. If you feel one or more of these 3 ways when you're around someone, it could be indicating that they're an emotional vampire. Now the second part of the guide is general do's and don'ts to handle emotional vampires. And I want to start with the do's. You should take a breath to center yourself. You should listen for intuition signaling danger. You should stay calm and matter of fact instead of going for their bait. You should pause and develop a plan to handle the situation before you react. And lastly, you should communicate clearly, firmly, and with a neutral tone when setting limits. And also when dealing with an emotional vampire, don't panic. Don't talk yourself out of intuitions or call yourself neurotic. Don't blurt out something you'll regret later or use an accusatory tone. Don't fight with the person. And don't do something like overeating or abusing a substance to medicate stress. From here, we reach the third part of the guide, which is to assess if you're an emotional vampire. There's some common indications if you are. People avoid you or glaze over during a conversation. You're self-obsessed. You're often negative. You gossip or badmouth other people. You're critical and controlling. And you're in an emotional black hole but you won't get help, which strains your relationships and won't free you. And from here we reach the final part of the guide, which is to identify and combat emotional vampires. Whether the vampire is somebody else or yourself, there's a handful of different types of emotional vampires, and this part of the guide will help you deal with these vampires, whether they be someone else or yourself. So the first type of emotional vampire is the narcissist. And you should ask yourself some questions to assess if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, or are a narcissist yourself. Does the person act like life revolves around them? Do you have to compliment them to get their attention or approval? Do they constantly steer the conversation back to themselves? Do they downplay your feelings or interests? And if they disagree with you, do they become cold or withholding? If the answer is yes to one or more of these questions, it's likely you're dealing with a narcissist. Now there's a few steps that can be taken to handling a narcissist. You should keep your expectations realistic, meaning that you must accept who they are and what they're like. Then from there you should never make your self-worth dependent on them. Don't get caught in the trap of always trying to please a narcissist. And lastly, you should show how something will be to their benefit. Because they care so much about themselves, by doing so this may be the best way to communicate with them and get your point across. From here we reach the second type of emotional vampire, which is the victim. It's a dependent type of personality. To assess if you're in a relationship with a victim or are a victim yourself, you should ask yourself these questions. Does the person often appear inconsolably oppressed or depressed? Are you burned out by their neediness? Do they always blame bad luck or unfairness of others for their problems? Do you screen your calls or say you're busy in order to dodge their complaints? And lastly, does their unrelenting negativity compromise your positive attitude? If you answered yes to one or more of these, it's likely that you're dealing with a victim or are a victim yourself. With people who are victims, firm limit setting is healthy. The victims must take responsibility for their own lives. From here we reach the third type of emotional vampire, which is the controller. This is an obsessive-compulsive type of personality. To assess if you're in a relationship with a controller or maybe a controller yourself, you should ask yourself these questions. Does the person keep claiming to know what's best for you? Do you typically have to do things in a particular way when you're around them? Are they so domineering you feel suffocated? Do you feel held prisoner by this person's rigid sense of order? And lastly, do you feel that the relationship is no fun because it lacks spontaneity? If you answered yes to one or more of these questions, it's likely that you're dealing with a controller or a controller yourself. There's 4 different methods to handling a controller. The first is to never try to control a controller. It's just simply a waste of time. Second, you should try the caring direct approach. The person may be truly unaware of their controlling nature. Third, you should set limits. And lastly, you should size up the situation, meaning that you should assess how much their controlling nature really matters. From here we reach the fourth type of emotional vampire, which is the criticizer. This could be looked at as people with mixed personalities. To assess if you're in a relationship with a criticizer or maybe a criticizer yourself, you should ask yourself these questions. Do you always end up feeling inadequate in the person's eyes? Are you a frequent target of their judgment? Do they spot a flaw in you from across the room, then tell you about it? Do they always put others down? And lastly, are they harshly self-critical? If you answered yes to one or more of these questions, it's likely that you're dealing with a criticizer, or maybe a criticizer yourself. Now, there's multiple things that can be done to handling criticizers. The first is to consider the source, meaning that you should verify if there's actually substance to what they're criticizing. You should also graciously let the comment pass. You should also address the misplaced criticism directly. And lastly, you should express appreciation for what's useful. From here we reach the last form of an emotional vampire, which is the splitter. To assess if you're in a relationship with a splitter, or maybe a splitter yourself, you should ask yourself these questions. Do you censor your true feelings because you fear the person's anger? Do you go through great pains to keep the peace? Do they keep you on an emotional roller coaster? Do they adore you when you meet their needs but show rage when you don't? And lastly, do you frequently feel wrongly accused? If you answered yes to one or more of these, it's likely that you're dealing with a splitter or that you're a splitter yourself. There's a handful of things that can be done when dealing with a splitter. The first is to establish boundaries and be solution-oriented. The second is to avoid skirmishes. The third is to refuse to take sides. The fourth is to quickly release negativity. And lastly, the fifth is to visualize a protective shield from negativity around you. This guide has no doubt given you the nuts and bolts for dealing with difficult people, as well as improving on your difficult nature. Nobody wants to deal with an emotional vampire or be an emotional vampire, and emotional vampires can no doubt hinder your pursuits. So by having better awareness surrounding emotional vampires, as well as understanding if you could be an emotional vampire, along with understanding how to handle emotional vampires, it will all no doubt assist in crafting a life of significance.
I'm just trying to make it all make sense.
The
More
You
No
Podcast.